the first time Alina Cruz stepped onto the Whitaker ranch. The wind nearly stole the paper from her hand, the one with the wages written on it. $12 a week, room in the back shed. Meals only when work allowed, and no promises beyond spring. She should have turned around right then, should have taken the long road back to town, and kept what little pride she had tucked under her ribs. But pride did not buy flour. Pride did not keep a roof over a woman and her sick father. So she tightened her faded shawl, lifted her chin against the Wyoming dust, and walked toward the biggest house she had ever seen, with its porch, dark windows, in silence that felt less like peace and more like judgment. And before she reached the first step, a little girl in scuffed boots and a red ribbon stared down at her from the railing, like she was trying to decide whether Alina belonged there at all. And that was the moment everything began to change. Because some doors do not swing open with a welcome. They test the soul. And some children do not ask your name first. They ask your heart. By noon, Alina had learned the rules of the place. Mrs. Whitaker had died the previous winter. The rancher, Caleb Whitaker, spoke only when necessary. His foreman spoke too much. The cook was leaving by Sunday, and the daughter, 6-year-old Maisie, had not smiled at a soul in 7 months. Alina was there to scrub floors, wash clothes, mend what could be mended, and stay out of the family's grief. That last rule was the one no one said aloud, but grief was hanging everywhere. And the curtains never changed, and the dust on the piano keys. In the way Caleb looked through people as if standing still might keep him from falling apart. And Alina, who had buried a mother young, knew the smell of sorrow as surely as she knew wood smoke and rain. She set down her bag in the back room, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work with the desperation of someone who could not afford to fail. Then the little girl appeared again in the kitchen doorway, watching with solemn storm-colored eyes, and asked, quiet as a prayer, "Are you staying long?" And Alina should have said only what was safe. But something in that child's face broke open an old tenderness inside her, and she answered, "Long enough to do what needs doing." And if the house had been listening, it might have trembled then, because sometimes the smallest promise is the one fate hears clearest. By the end of the first week, the ranch hands had already made up their minds about her. To them, she was just the hired help from the wrong side of town. Too poor to count, too foreign in name and manner for their liking. And the foreman, Wade Mercer, carried that opinion like a badge. He watched her every move as if waiting for her to fail. And when he caught Maisie sitting in the washroom one evening, listening to Alina hum an old Spanish lullaby while folding towels, he snapped that servants were paid to clean, not to fill a child's head with nonsense. The words hit harder than they should have, maybe because Alina had heard that tone before, maybe because Maisie flinched as though she had been the one slapped, and maybe because Caleb stood at the doorway and said nothing. Not while Alina pressed her mouth shut and returned to the towels like the song had never existed. But that night, when the moon sat pale over the corral and the ranch finally slept, there came a knock at her door. She opened it to find Caleb holding a tray with cold biscuits and black coffee. Awkward as a man carrying his own shame, he did not apologize. He only said, "No one on this ranch tells you how to comfort my daughter but me." Then after a beat that seemed to cost him something, he added, "And I don't know how anymore." There it was. The first crack in the stone, and trouble always begins when pain finally finds a voice. After that, the days grew heavier and stranger at once. Alina began rising before dawn to light the stove, knead bread, and mend shirts by lantern glow. Then spending the afternoons chasing dust from corners and life back into a house that had almost forgotten both. And somehow, without ever forcing it, she began drawing Maisie into the ordinary rhythm of living again. First it was little things, a hand offered to shell peas, a question about how to braid dough, a silent presence beside the wash line. Then it was stories, not fairy tales, but stories of real women, stubborn women, women who crossed deserts with babies on their hips and grief in their throats, and still found a way to sing at sunset. Maisie listened to every word like a thirsty field takes rain. And one afternoon, while Caleb rode fence on the south pasture, Alina found the child in the barn trying to saddle the old mare that had belonged to her mother. The mare kicked, the stool tipped, and in one terrible second, Maisie could have been crushed. But Alina lunged, pulled the girl clear, and took the blow against her own shoulder instead. Pain burst through her so sharp it turned the world white, and when Caleb came running, he found Alina on one knee, pale and shaking, with his daughter clutched alive against her chest. And that was the kind of moment no wages could account for. From then on, Caleb's silence changed shape. It no longer felt like a locked gate. It felt like a man standing in a burned field, wondering whether anything green could grow again. He began asking Alina if she needed liniment for her shoulder, whether her father in town had enough wood for winter. Small questions, but witnesses came with gossip. By October, the church ladies were whispering that Caleb had grown too dependent on the help. Wade Mercer muttered to anyone who would listen that boundaries were being crossed. And when a banker from Cheyenne arrived with papers tied in blue ribbon and talk of debt, the whole fragile piece showed its true weakness. Caleb had lost cattle in the winter storm, had borrowed against spring calves, had more land than cash and more pride than sense. The ranch was balanced on a knife edge. One bad sale, one failed payment, and the Whitakers would lose everything. Alina overheard enough from the hallway to understand the shape of disaster. And that evening she found Caleb in the barn with both hands braced against a post, staring into the dark as if he could force tomorrow to change by will alone. "You should go before it gets worse," he said. A woman with any sense would leave this place now. Alina ought to have agreed, ought to have packed before dawn. But she had not come this far to run at the first sight of ruin. And besides, some people become family long before the world gives them permission. So she answered, "I have seen worse than hunger, and I have seen worse than men losing land. What I have not seen is a little girl survive losing everyone who loves her." Caleb closed his eyes then. Just for a second, like the truth had struck somewhere tender. And when he looked at her again, there was no rancher and servant in that stare. Only two weary souls meeting in the middle of the storm. Winter came early, hard and merciless. Snow laid itself over the fields like a warning. Pipes froze, cattle wandered, feed ran short, and the ranch became less a home than a test of endurance. The men worked till their beards iced over. Alina kept broth on the stove and blankets warming by the fire. Maisie caught a fever the week before Christmas, and fear moved through that house like a wolf through a broken fence. The doctor was 2 towns away, and the river road half-iced shut. Caleb sat by the child's bed with the look of a man about to lose the last thing God had left him. But it was Alina who knew what to do in the long hours between medicine and prayer. Alina, who cooled the girl's skin, changed the cloth, whispered the steady songs her own mother had once used to carry children through sickness. Alina, who stayed awake 3 nights straight while the storm battered the shutters, and on the 4th morning, when the fever finally broke and pale winter light spilled across the bed, Maisie opened her eyes, saw Alina bent over her, and reached up with a weak little hand. Caleb was standing there, close enough to hear it clear as church bells, and the child, still half in dream, smiled for the first time anyone could remember and whispered, "Mama." The room went utterly still, because there are moments so holy and so heartbreaking that the world itself seems afraid to touch them. Elena's first instinct was to step back, to correct the child, to put the hard, clean line back where it belonged, because the world had rules, and women like her paid dearly for forgetting them. But Maisie's fingers clung to hers with the desperate trust only a child can give, and Caleb, with tears standing in the eyes of a man who probably had not cried since the day he buried his wife, said nothing at all. He did not explain it away. He only bowed his head as if something larger than grief had entered the room, and he was wise enough not to interrupt. In town, the whispers kept coming, crueler now, sharper. But by then whispers could not compete with what had already taken root inside that snowbound house. Alina was no longer moving through the rooms like a guest. She was part of the pulse of the place, in the bread that rose before dawn, in the laughter slowly returning to the table, and on Christmas Eve, when the wind quieted and the stars came out above the white land, Caleb asked Alina to walk with him to the porch. No grand speech came from him. The plain honesty of a man who had been broken and remade by loss. "I hired you for wages," he said. staring out at the pasture, silvered with frost. But somewhere along the way, you became the only reason this place still feels like home. Alina looked down at her work-roughened hands, at the porch boards dusted with snow, at the life she had entered by necessity and stayed in by love. And she thought of the paper she had once carried. The wages, the room, the meals, only when work allowed. How small that bargain seemed now, compared to what the season had written in silence and sacrifice. And inside, from the glow of the parlor, came Maisie's laughing voice calling for both of them. And that was how Christmas found them, not with riches, not with certainty, but with something stronger than either, a family born where no one had expected it, under a roof held together by grief, courage, and grace. And if you had ridden past the Whitaker Ranch that winter, you might have seen only snow, cattle, and smoke curling from a chimney into the dark. But if you had stepped inside, you would have understood the truth some people spend their whole lives learning. That love does not always arrive dressed as blessing. Sometimes it comes wearing work boots, carrying a mending basket, asking only for wages. And before the season is through, it is the very thing a broken home learns to call by name.